Hi, good evening, everyone, and welcome to another edition of our Justice and Pieces guest speaker series. Today, we are joined by counsel from the Ontario Human Rights Commission. He's going to tell you all about what he does and how he got there. So, thank you so much, Sunil, for taking the time and joining us here today.
Oh, my pleasure.
Now, perhaps, Sunil, maybe you can tell us kind of what drew you into law in the first place and maybe a little bit about your background leading to what you're doing today.
Sure. Yes, I'm counsel at the Ontario Human Rights Commission, but I'm also an adjunct professor at my old law school, Western University. So I'm leading a research project there called the Hidden Racial Profiling Project. And I'm also teaching a class on racial profiling and policing there. But let's go way back. How did I get to law school? What made me go there? Why law? Like probably many of your viewers and perhaps yourself, John Paul, my journey wasn't linear. So I got a commerce degree at Queen's, and I almost became an accountant, an actuary, and a consultant. But law was always in the back of my mind. I debated in high school and went to the national finals and in the bilingual category, but now my French is terrible. So I really enjoyed a labor arbitration class at Queen's where we did a mock arbitration. And essentially, I loved being on my feet, and I still do. So while I was at Queen's, I was working summers at CIBC doing research for their insurance strategy. Sounds really exciting, right? And I wasn't ready to work full time after graduation. And, I was lucky enough that, my family and we had the means to send me to law school. So I applied to law school and chose Western in London, Ontario. Didn't want to live at home in Toronto, and got a small scholarship there. So that's how I got to law school. And I summered and articled at a large management side labor and employment law firm, Hicks Morley. They represent employers like banks, school boards, police, large companies. And I was really interested in labor and employment law because it's about people and it provides lots of opportunities to be on your feet and litigate. That was the most important to me. And at Hicks Morley, that's where I really got exposed to human rights. So I wrote a response on behalf of a police services board to a complaint filed with the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario that alleged racial discrimination in policing. And I thought, wow, this is really interesting. So I finished articling at the height of the recession in 2009. I didn't get hired back. And this is really important. I want your viewers to know this. Like, I didn't get hired back, and it was tough finding a job afterwards. I was unemployed for about 6 months, and I doubted myself. And, I want everyone to know that you're going to go through bumps in the road. It's really important to know that. So I churned out a ton of applications. I'd be meeting many lawyers for coffee, going for interviews. And I'll never forget what Professor Margaret Capes at Western Law told me. She was my professor in our social welfare advocacy class. And she said, regardless of where you end up when you leave Western, I know that you're all taking this class for a reason. She was right. And in the back of my mind, I've always wanted to help people. That's something that's been instilled in me from a very young age. So I saw a job posting in the Ontario reports for a staff lawyer position at the African Canadian Legal Clinic. So I caught a break and got the job. The African Canadian Legal Clinic was a specialty legal clinic of Legal Aid Ontario that fought anti-Black racism through test case litigation, public legal education, intake, and law reform activities. And I was hooked. I got to write a Supreme Court factum about hate speech and be on the agenda with Steve Paikin before I was 30. And I've never looked back, and thinking about how difficult it was for me to get a position after articling, I always make time to mentor students. So after about 2 years there, I made the move to the Ontario Human Rights Commission, and I broadened my human rights practice to include all grounds of discrimination under the Human Rights Code. And I've been there ever since.
Perfect. Thanks, so much for sharing there. And maybe you can tell us a bit about what you're doing here at the Ontario Human Rights Commission. What's the breadth of, you mentioned all the grounds of discrimination and that you can work in, but what do you do? What's the Ontario Human Rights Commission versus, people hear about the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal and, the Human Rights Code. So how does this all fit together?
Right. So the commission is one of three pillars of the human rights system in Ontario. So the other pillars are the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario and the Human Rights Legal Support Center. So all three are creatures of the Ontario Human Rights Code. So the code, the Human Rights Code, is a provincial law that gives everyone equal rights and opportunities without discrimination in specific social areas like jobs, housing, services, facilities, and contracts or agreements. So I'll start with the tribunal. So the tribunal, that's where human rights complaints called applications are filed and decided. It's an administrative tribunal for human rights matters filed under the Human Rights Code. And if you feel you've been the victim of discrimination, the Human Rights Legal Support Center provides free legal assistance. They can help you file your application with the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario. They can represent you at mediation, settlement conference, and they can represent you at the hearing itself. And the commission is an independent agency of the provincial government. Its job is to promote and enforce human rights, to engage in relationships that embody the principles of dignity and respect, and to create a culture of human rights compliance and accountability. It's largely concerned with addressing systemic discrimination. So patterns of discrimination, discrimination that's institution-wide, that affects many vulnerable people. And it does that in a variety of ways. It does that through policy development, public education, inquiries, and litigation. So policies that advance a progressive understanding of the rights under the code and tell organizations what they need to do to meet their obligations to not engage in discrimination. And it helps people know their rights. Public education, so people know about their rights under the Human Rights Code, for example, or how to spot and identify and address discrimination, different types of discrimination, or in different sectors, for example. And then there are inquiries and litigation. Inquiries are basically investigations. And if you're the respondent in a commission inquiry, you're obligated, if you're responding in a public interest inquiry under the Human Rights Code, and the commission asks for documents or data, well, the respondent is obligated to provide data and documents that are or may be relevant under that inquiry. And then there's litigation, strategic litigation. So the commission can intervene in other people's applications if, for example, those applications may affect human rights law in a big way or affect lots of vulnerable people. The commission can start its own applications. It can launch its own complaints under the Human Rights Code as well. And the commission intervenes in cases before the courts that will affect human rights law in a big way or deal with systemic discrimination. So there are currently 6 lawyers in the Legal Services and Inquiries Office of the Human Rights Commission. So our client is the chief commissioner and the part-time commissioners, all of whom are appointed by the provincial government. They're like our board of directors. And so the chief commissioner is Patricia Daguerre, a huge human rights expert, leader, and activist. So those are my clients. And then there's management, of course, our executive director, Raj Dheer, and other managers of the various departments. So as counsel, I primarily work on the enforcement side of our mandate, so the inquiries and the litigation, but I also support the other functions. So a big area of focus for me, and has been for over a decade, is racism in policing. So first as a staff lawyer at the African Canadian Legal Clinic, and then as a lawyer at the commission, and even now as with my work at Western. So I've litigated cases, delivered public education sessions to Black youth on their right to be free from racial profiling, published articles, written reports, submissions, teaching a class on racial profiling and policing, doing research on the phenomenon. But most importantly, I've learned from lived experiences. So Anti-Black racism and anti-Indigenous racism in policing in Canada, in this country, is systemic. It's a day-to-day reality for Black people, Indigenous people, and the effects are devastating. So right now, I'm counsel for the commission in our inquiry into anti-Black racism by the Toronto Police Service.
Now, I don't know. I mean, I guess maybe here's where you have that disclaimer. Your own views are different from the commission and things like that. But I mean, since you brought it up and it's obviously a topic, and given the Truth and Reconciliation Day coming up this week with Indigenous people, what can you share from all of that? All of your work is maybe even talk about what you're teaching at Western in terms of policing and racism, and what have you kind of uncovered? And I mean, feel free to go in kind of any direction you want with it. But it's such an important topic. I know that there's been cases. I think that we were talking about a mutual friend we have. I remember, I think it was a case that he had about a young girl in Peel region.
Yes.
I might be mistaken it, but I believe so. It was maybe last year. But what can you share kind of from all of this? And it's important here for my students to take heed about.
Yes, certainly. So what I would say first is that there is systemic racism in policing in this country. So it's a day-to-day reality for Black Indigenous people. So, let me talk about my first client when I was at the African Canadian Legal Clinic. So my first client is a Black man, and he was driving home from work, and he was taken down at gunpoint by the police in his own driveway. Two of my other first clients were a Black mother and her son. He was tasered twice while handcuffed outside of a plaza next to his high school. There are so many Canadian court decisions and research studies that demonstrate that there's systemic racism in policing, that Black and Indigenous people face racism across the spectrum of police interactions, from the beginning, from stop and question activities to arrests and use of force. They're over-policed. They're more likely to be stopped, questioned, carded, or street checked. We've seen huge overrepresentations of Black and Indigenous people in street checks or carding, and the effects of that are devastating. We know that Black and Indigenous people are grossly overrepresented in fatal encounters with police in Canada. Last year, protests erupted in America over the failure to charge officers for the death of Breonna Taylor. But here in Canada, none of the officers in the cases involving Black and Indigenous deaths from 2000 to 2017, none of them have been criminally convicted, zero. And what the commission found through its inquiry, it's also disturbing. So for example, the commission found that between 2013 and 2017, a Black person was nearly 20 times more likely than a white person to be involved in a fatal shooting by the Toronto Police Service, a huge racial disparity that's persisted from the early 2000s. And the commission looked at charge and arrest data involving the Toronto Police. And the commission found that Black people bear a disproportionate burden of law enforcement. We looked at 9 discretionary lower level charges from 2013 to 2017. Black people represent 8.8% of Toronto's population, but almost a third of those charges. White people were underrepresented. Only 20% of the charges examined by the commission, regardless of race, resulted in a conviction, but charges against Black people were more likely to be withdrawn. Indigenous people also face racism through underpolicing. They're viewed as less worthy victims, and crimes against them are not investigated as thoroughly. So, we think about the role of police in apprehending children and Indigenous children and bringing them to residential schools, but we know that Indigenous people continue to face racism in policing. So we know, for example, there are serious concerns about racism and sexism in police investigations of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. So in 2015, for example, families of murdered Indigenous women told the United Nations about a, quote, failure by the police to treat cases of missing Aboriginal women in an urgent manner and to carry out adequate investigations. A Métis woman told the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Inquiry that, quote, when a crime happens, there aren't thorough with investigations. They just assume it's domestic violence from the men in our community. It feels like our women are worth less than others. Really powerful words. So what I would tell your viewers is that north of the border, racism and policing is real, and Black and Indigenous people are really feeling the effects. It's a Canadian problem. So we must look inward and we must fight for change, and that's all of our responsibility.
So I guess the follow up then is, what are the things I guess like you're doing and the commission are doing, and what are your students learning about in terms of ways to tackle this? I mean, it's not like it's going to happen overnight, but what are some of the steps that we can do to deal with the systemic racism that's happening?
So let me tell you what I'm doing at Western, and then I can give you some tips on what students should do. So I have a project with Western's Faculty of Law. It's called the Hidden Racial Profiling Project. And, you know, in the words of former US Congressman John Lewis, I hope it creates some good trouble. So what I want to do is make invisible racial profiling visible and get the attention it deserves. And I'm providing an applied research opportunity to law students interested in racial justice. So what we're doing is we're identifying recent cases from the criminal courts involving the 10 largest city police forces across Canada. And we're looking for violations of the charter. We're looking for arbitrary detentions or unreasonable searches or excessive force. And what we're going to do is contact defense counsel and accuse to determine the race of the victims in those cases. And I expect that we're going to find many cases that involve Black or Indigenous victims that are consistent with racial profiling. And we're going to make those cases visible. So to me, a clear example is the Queen in Bonds, a 2010 decision of the Ontario Court of Justice involving the Ottawa Police. So the Ontario Court of Justice concluded that Ottawa police officers violated the rights of Stacey Bonds. This is really hard to hear. She was arrested for public intoxication in 2008, but the arrest was unlawful. She was not publicly intoxicated or a threat to herself or anyone else. She was taken to a holding cell at the police station and was strip searched by multiple officers, including a male officer who used scissors to cut off her bra. She was left half naked in the cell for over 3 hours and soiled her pants. The decision makes no mention of the fact that Ms. Bonds is Black or the issue of racial profiling. But in my opinion, it's clearly consistent with racial profiling. So what can law students do to address, for example, racism in policing? And how can you make good trouble? So I think the first thing and the most important thing to do is to learn from lived experiences. So read Robin Maynard's Policing Black Lives, State Violence in Canada from Slavery to the Present. Read the Commission's interim reports on its inquiry into racism, anti-Black racism by the Toronto Police. Read the Office of the Independent Police Review Director's report on its investigation to the Thunder Bay Police, Broken Trust, where it found that the Thunder Bay Police engaged in racism against Indigenous peoples. Read the inquiry report into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and look at how the police were conducting the investigations, and engage with members of Black and Indigenous communities. Provide public education, public legal education. Help Black and Indigenous people know their rights when they're stopped by police and their right to be free from racial profiling. Mobilize. You can take part in the conversation. You can protest. You can participate through art or social media. You can, while you're in law school, you can organize. You can form a social justice organization. You can partner with Black and Indigenous community and advocacy groups. Ask questions. Form an organization and ask questions of police, like how many police officers have been disciplined for racial profiling in the past 5 years? Does the police force look like the communities they're serving? Can I see your policy on racial profiling? And it doesn't need to be your day job now or after graduation. So have difficult conversations in your communities, workplaces, classrooms, homes. Challenge and confront bias and prejudice. Change often starts with a conversation. So, it's tough. It's tough to break into human rights and have human rights be your only practice area, the truth is there aren't many legal jobs out there, aren't many lawyer positions where you can work exclusively in human rights. So think about other ways to get involved. So it could be part of your practice. What if you work for a union side labor and employment law firm, for example, and human rights is part of your practice where you're representing employees or unions. That's generally a tip in terms of getting into human rights. But let's say you don't do any of those things. Let's say you work in intellectual property or corporate law. Well, it's still all our responsibility to do something, in my opinion, to address systemic racism in policing. So racism in policing destroys economic opportunities for Black and Indigenous people. So it can result in charges, guilty pleas, sentences, imprisonment, and trauma, which destroy the financial health of families. So you can do pro bono work to further economic opportunities and uplift Black and Indigenous people. So what if you helped a Black or Indigenous community or advocacy group set up a charity? What if you helped a Black or Indigenous business who needed some IP advice to get their startup off the ground? So it's all our responsibility. There's something that we can all do, and it's up to all of us to stand up to racism in policing.
So, Neil, you mentioned obviously Western there, and I think we were talking about your career path there, but you mentioned also now going and doing the course there. How did you get into that, and how do you find, especially, I don't know if it's in person or it's remote these days there, but how are you finding that, and how's that experience been for you?
It's been incredible. So I taught the class 2 years ago, and I'm teaching it again this spring. And the students had so many insightful comments. We had real rich discussions. And for me, it was important to make the class practical, right? And that's something that's often missing from legal education. So I threw a bunch of fact scenarios at them. The legal writing assignment was a factum. I got them to think like lawyers and policy advisors on both sides of the issue. And that was very important to me. So how did I get that going? It started with guest lectures, right? It started with guest lectures at Western and other law schools, and then really getting my feet wet, learning how to present effectively. I also published. I wrote a book chapter in an Irwin Law book on racial profiling and human rights law. So getting published, doing lots of speaking engagements, doing a ton of guest lectures, developing a relationship with my own law school, and it just snowballed from there. And that's partly what led to the research project that I'm doing right now.
So now you had mentioned they're kind of having a little bit of time there after articles, so really important for you to share there. Now, I know certainly right now, especially there's all difficulties in maybe even securing articles and then the path right after and once you get called. What can you share with students who are maybe going through that anxiety right now, or even going back to like, some go to the OCIs or some go for looking for like a second year summer job. What can you share kind of from your experience that, that they can kind of look to and say, well, it's not at the end of the world if I don't get a job or the minute I'm done writing the barrister and solicitor's exams?
Mm-hmm. So my advice is that you're not alone. So you may look around and you may see so many of your friends who, got a summer job through the OCI process, which leads to articling. But there are so many students, including myself, who will experience bumps in the roads, and even then, where you end up, where your summary and articling may not be where you end up, and you may move multiple times. But I think what I would recommend doing is applying broadly, right? It's partly a function of numbers, statistics, probability. Apply broadly. But also, I think there are two things that are really important if you're interested in litigation in particular. It's to hone your written and oral advocacy skills. That's more important, in my opinion, than the side you may be on, whether you're on management side or employee or applicant side. If you're honing those skills, that will make you super marketable. And the second big piece of advice, and it's related to the first, is find good mentors, people who will champion you, who will teach you how to hone your craft. That could be within, the space where you're working, or it could be outside. And those two things will get you really far, right? And so, yes, of course, networking is extremely important. But the best thing you can do to network is to do good work, because that will get noticed.
Now, Sunil, you mentioned oral and written advocacy, and I think certainly that kind of, especially oral advocacy, sometimes you have like that deer in the headlights moment. What can you share about that specifically for those who are, maybe a little intimidated about either appearing before the tribunal or something? What's worked for you, and what can you share about kind of that experience?
So, preparation. So that is the most important thing to do. So, fully immerse yourself in the case, prepare, read the cases such that you're prepared to answer any questions about those cases. But one of my mentors, who used to be a lawyer at the commission, who's now since retired, her name's Kathy Pike. She gave me some really good advice when you're preparing for litigation. It's prepare for the fringes of your case. It's really easy to know the four corners of your argument, what the case is really about and how to respond to the burning questions about that. But if you think about those remote things, something that may not necessarily come up, but if it does, how do I respond to that? Something that may engage a policy argument, or something that requires a novel interpretation of the law. That's if you can master the fringes, then the core is super easy. So prepare for the fringes, know your case inside and out, and lean on your colleagues. The best way to prepare for litigation is to do a mock run through. Have your colleagues ask you questions, and they'll give you tips on how to best respond. And don't feel like you have to respond right away. So, take a moment, take a breath, pause, and read those very important notes that are being passed to you by your colleagues while you're up there. I'd say that's, preparation. Prepare the core of your case, but also the fringes. Practice. Those are the most important things.
Now, maybe taking a step back then, and let's look at the preparation itself there in terms of the written advocacy. Now, what, if anything, do you find different if you're doing an application, right? You say, well, maybe we might be intervening on behalf of someone, or maybe assisting on something. What's different there when you're looking at a case that may be going to the tribunal, the Human Rights Tribunal, versus putting together a factum if it was, say, a criminal or a civil matter, or do you find the two things are very similar?
I think what's, the best thing to read in terms of written advocacy is Forget the Wind-Up and Make the Pitch by Justice Laskin. I see you nodding there, John Paul. Maybe it's something you get your students to read. That is the most important. It talks about how to write persuasively, point first writing, simple phrases. That's the best thing to do in terms of written advocacy. But when you're in my field, when you're in human rights law, whether it's at the tribunal or in court, I think one of the most important things to do is set out what your theory of the case is, and get the court, get the tribunal to see themselves in the shoes of your client, or of the group that you're fighting for. That's the most important. Get them to see the injustice that they're facing. Make it a truly human story, and that will really help.
Now, perhaps for my students who certainly they've studied the Human Rights Tribunal and the Human Rights Code, but maybe we look at it from the perspective of, let's say there's an application coming forth. Kind of give us a general overview of when someone comes in and we're like, okay, we're going to get involved on this case, how it goes from there to a decision coming out by the tribunal?
Yeah, so let's talk about the application process generally. So under the Human Rights Code, you have 1 year from the last incident of discrimination to file your application, your complaint with the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario. So if you feel you've been the victim of discrimination, you generally have 1 year to file your application, right? And you can file it, of course, against your employer, your landlord, a respondent, or services, if it's policing, for example, or education. So you file your application. You can get assistance, of course, from the Human Rights Legal Support Center or private counsel. And so you file your application, and then the respondent has a few weeks. I think it used to be 30 days. I'm not sure if it's 60 now. I think so. The respondent has about a few weeks to respond to your human rights application. They'll file their response, and then the next step is mediation. So if you want to have a settlement conference, you can consent and say, yes, I want to have a settlement conference, and provided the respondent and the applicant agree, then you'll have a settlement conference before a mediator of the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario. If it settles, and many cases do, that'll be the end of it. There's a settlement. If it doesn't, and it's not dismissed for other reasons, like there wasn't a summary hearing about whether there was a reasonable prospect for success or something like that, or there's no jurisdictional issue, then it would go to a hearing. And then the tribunal would conduct the hearing. It would hear testimony from the applicant and witnesses. It would get evidence in the form of documents, for example. It would hear the evidence from the respondent, and it would take all that together and then decide whether there was discrimination, whether a prohibited ground of discrimination was a factor in the adverse treatment that you received. And if it did find that there was discrimination, then it'll consider a remedy. So the tribunal can order money. So there's money for general damages for injury to dignity, and feelings and self-respect. So general damages. You could get lost wages, for example, as well, if it's in employment. The tribunal can also order public interest remedies, and that's what the commission is really interested in litigation. So systemic remedies, remedies to make sure that this discrimination doesn't happen to someone like you again. So changes to policies or procedures or ordering data collection, things like that. So that's an overview of the process. And the commission, our job is to address systemic discrimination. So we hear about cases from the media, or members of the private bar will get in touch with us. And for example, and then the lawyers at the commission would assess, the right opinion and assess whether the commission should intervene. For example, in a human rights application, will it affect human rights law in a big way? Does it affect lots of vulnerable people? And then our client, that's where we get instructions from, will decide whether the commission should intervene. And the commission, if it intervenes with the consent of the applicant, it's a full party. So it can call evidence, it can cross-examine witnesses, it can participate in settlement discussions, it can make submissions on remedy. So that's an overview of the process, sort of with and without the commission.
And I know this all kind of came together because one of my students that have been helping here has was doing their secondment at the Human Rights Commission. So maybe you can tell us a bit about kind of what any students that do get that there, or any other students. I mean, I also teach paralegal students, so I think the possibility of doing some internship there, what it's like in terms of that experience for students.
So you are, as a student at the commission, you are thrown right into everything, and you're a full member of the team. So as a articling student, for example, you will assist with the advisory work. You'll assist with drafting opinions and memos. You will help analyze data and documents in an inquiry. You will write, for example, motions to intervene before the courts. You can write parts of inquiry reports. You can do You might be doing citations for a factum that we write. So you can participate in public education sessions. You can do case law research to inform the development of our policies or the arguments that we may make. You do everything. You're a member of the team. So the experience is really rich and I think rewarding. So, if I was just graduating law school right now and I applied, thinking about what my grades were like back there, which were not bad, but I don't think I'd get in. We get over 200 applications for one articling spot at the commission. So it is really difficult to get in. We do have a few secondments. We've done in the past with some law firms. So this past year we had Vivian from not from Blake's but from Faskin's, and we had a student from Blake's as well. So, but we also have senior policy analysts, for example. So, and a lot of the senior policy analysts are lawyers, and they're not practicing lawyers, but they're lawyers. So there are non-traditional legal careers, right? And so, I'm a member of the Ontario Public Service, and so we may occasionally have postings for jobs. They would be on the Ontario Public Services website. But we participate in the Law Society of Ontario's articling recruitment process for Toronto for that one coveted articling spot. But that's the thing. So if you're interested in working with the commission or in human rights in general, what I would say is, join student clubs or volunteer with community or advocacy groups that fight for human rights. Talk to your professors who are involved in human rights, involved in human rights research, and try and get involved with their research. Be flexible, find opportunities to fight for human rights, even if it doesn't become part of your day job or all of your day job. And listen to lived experiences. Number one, that's the most important thing.
Now, over the last little while, I mean, things have been done remotely, and I don't know how that's kind of affected the hearings and just the whole process. Anything that you can kind of share? Any tips there, any advice in dealing with, I mean, I don't know how long it's going to go or when we're switching back to in person, hopefully sooner than later, but what have you found in terms of the changes, with technology and stuff in being able to advocate?
So, I find it is difficult to collaborate when we're all working remotely. But I find it's easier to sit down and focus and write. So in that sense, this, remote working was at a good time in the sense that I've been writing quite a bit, helping write our final inquiry report on our inquiry, for example. But, getting out there and being out in communities is obviously more difficult without in light of COVID and remote working. That's clearly more difficult. And if you think, and we know that people that file human rights applications or just generally victims of discrimination, they're the most disenfranchised in our society. And so there's often they're often impoverished. They may not have stable access to internet or a computer, and so that, I'd say, it makes our work harder. It does.
Yeah, so Sunil, thanks so much for taking the time here, joining us, sharing everything that you've done here. I know we've talked a lot about advice and what students can kind of look forward to. But if there's anything maybe you can kind of summarize, there any words of wisdom for all of the students that are listening, and or even the young lawyers as well and paralegals about getting into human rights. I know we've again, like I said, talked quite a bit about it, but what can you kind of share about what the future holds? And maybe if you were looking back to, I think you said 2009 or 2008, kind of around the same time I was finishing law school, but at Sunil back then, what would you tell him, if anything, what lies ahead for him in the future?
Wow, I'd say get ready for a lot of gray hair and dealing with kids. But I think there's a lot of advice. Don't be a perfectionist because that can lead to some real anxiety. Um, I'd say I'd say network. Learn. I'd say find people that you identify with who are doing work that you like and talk to them. I'd say, pay it forward. Think about all the people that have helped you along the way, and don't forget to pay it forward. And keep your head down. It's going to be okay. You're going to get through it. And it's really tough. You always think I test case litigation is really challenging. That's what I do often because there's no clear path. You're always trying to push the envelope. So that difficulty, where you feel like you don't know what you're doing, it really never goes away. You just have to learn how to deal with it.
I guess on that, how do you, I mean, maybe any on the point of when you're dealing with this and, you're pushing that envelope and you're making that good trouble, what, to kind of deal with any of that, maybe the anxiety of kind of being involved there and okay, now I'm going to, have to raise issues that make people uncomfortable, right? How do you get that thick skin to sort of advocate there on behalf of your clients and raise these issues, how to zealously advocate for your clients there without feeling this like fear or anything that what I'm pushing forward there is going to lead to some backlash in terms of not winning over a lot of friends or something like that.
So yeah, this work is certainly rewarding and it's really challenging. But that's what also makes the work exciting. So we're always trying to push the envelope. We're always trying to make novel arguments. None of my cases are the same. There's no clear path, and the stakes and the pressure are really high. So it's daunting because I feel like thousands of vulnerable people are counting on me. So what do you do in the face of that? Well, I'm grateful for the privilege to be a human rights lawyer, and I know the oath that I took and the oath that we all take when we're called to the bar to protect the human rights of Ontarians. And I know that I'm privileged that I went to law school and have become a lawyer. I remember that, sometimes you're not going to get the slam dunk, the big score, the change that's going to affect everybody right away and make everybody's problems go away. It's often about incremental change. And, so it's one step at a time. Venting with my colleagues certainly helps, right? But also enjoying time with family and friends. So when I come home, see my daughter's smiling faces, see my wife, Monica, I forget the tough parts of the job. So that's the advice I give.
And we certainly talked about racism. I just one more question here about our profession itself, right? I mean, it's nice to know when we see diversity, especially in all the people I've got a chance to talk to. So on that point, I mean, what have you seen, I guess, since you were called into 2021, and what more can we do to see more people like us that are coming through the ranks there, and what can they do to kind of push through and we've had all studies and things like that, and what are the next steps?
So, I want to be clear here. These are my views and don't necessarily represent the views of the commission. And so what I think is important, particularly for racialized students, is to be able to see themselves as lawyers, right? So when we were young, it would be amazing. Like, we may not have those networks where our friends' parents are lawyers. So then how can we see ourselves as lawyers? So it starts as lawyers. So it starts really young, that mentorship and that guidance. So that's, you have to start all the way back then. But in terms of reducing barriers for racialized lawyers and law students, I think there's so much that needs to be done. So number one, if it doesn't get measured, it doesn't get done. You have to collect human rights-based data throughout the process. So who is applying, who's getting in, who's advancing, and what's happening in their careers, and where are people falling off. And so then we can further identify where the problems are and whether the solutions are working. But I also believe there should be special programs to ensure that law students look like the diversity of Canada or Ontario. So special recruitment such that there are separate categories for example, Black or Indigenous law students. I think that there should be special mentorship for Black, Indigenous, and racialized law students as well. And then, and of course, there's so many things that firms can do as well. So there needs to be accountability, there needs to be education, and we need to see ourselves as lawyers at a very young age.
Okay, so perfect. So thank you so much there for taking all the time joining us here, sharing all of that valuable insight, and we appreciate you joining us. And thanks for everyone for tuning in, and wish you all the best.
Thanks.
And thanks, Vivian, for organizing.